with Graeme in his home in Brinkham, where he has built this vertical garden wall. Graeme, could you please tell us a little bit about what you've done with the space?
Okay, so when we first acquired this place, there was just a blank wall and lots of gravel. There were no plants in here. There was no shade. There was a pond, but there were no plants in the pond either, and no fish. And so it was just really hot and really bright and really stark. And I got an idea about 10 years ago. I saw something on television or on the internet about a commercial vertical garden on the side of a building somewhere, and it was just amazing. And I always thought that would be a really cool thing to do. And so I had this idea, well, rather than, in addition to growing plants in the garden bed, why don't we try and grow plants on the wall? And then I started thinking about how to do it, and there's all kinds of stuff on YouTube. You can go on Google and you can see people making vertical wall gardens that have all kinds of materials. But I wanted to use recycled materials, I wanted to repurpose materials, I didn't want to spend money on stuff. It's a tropical environment, it's very hot, so I didn't want stuff that was going to perish necessarily straight away. And I was conscious that plants need a lot of water, so they have to be in pots. They couldn't just be in some form of loose situation. So I started experimenting, and this was just after the cyclone a couple of years ago. And I came across the idea of using these old bits of galvanised weld mesh pool fencing as a frame to hang pots in.
What materials have you used to get your garden started here?
So, just after the cyclone a couple of years ago, people had thrown out all this old damaged pool fencing, this sort of galvanised, weld mesh fencing. And I thought that'd make a useful frame that that was sturdy, that you could support pots on. So I started with that, and then I played around with different types of pots, and I ended up, I wanted something I could get lots of, like hundreds of. And the only thing I could think of was milk cartons, plastic milk cartons. Now, eventually, they're probably going to, the ones that grow to the sun are going to perish in the sun, but once they're covered in plants, they're quite protected and they last a long time. And they're cheap, you can get them from people's recycling bins, and in my case, from the office at work. I just started acquiring those and then figuring out how to cut them and shape them and clip them into the wire mesh, which is what I've done. So on the top rung, which is a lot more exposed to sun, I've started using terracotta pots, but they're a bit more harder to come by. And so I don't have that completely covered with terracotta pots. In some cases I just use regular black plastic pots as well. But eventually the plan is to completely replace the top rung with terracotta pots. And of course there's an irrigation system, and that's really simple. All it is just black poly pipe. There's vertical risers and then small 1/2 centimetre gauge pipe running horizontally across about every second run, and above each column of pots there's a hole, 2 holes in each of those tubes, and so it comes on for a couple of minutes a day, not long, and that's enough water to drip through the whole system. And then it flows out the bottom into the garden or into the pond.
And did you set up that irrigation by yourself?
Yeah, it's really simple. It's just connected to a timer on the mains tap. The other way of doing it would be to have on a pump that's recycling water out of the pond. I didn't do that, but could do that. Yeah. And then of course there's a little bit of organic fertiliser in these, because obviously there's not much soil, so the plants need fertiliser. And so there's a risk that, so as a result of that, I've got lots of aquatic plants growing in the pond to absorb those nutrients. Yeah, so in terms of plants, I just had this idea of growing lots of ferns, and there's plenty of ferns available in Darwin. You can buy ferns from Bunnings, you can find them out in the bush, and I had friends with ferns, and I just tried experimenting. And for a lot of ferns, the way they grow, you can then propagate them asexually. So you can, one plant you can then split up and then disperse, and so that's what I've done. I don't know how many types of ferns there are here, but there's probably about a dozen species. And in actual fact, Bunnings was a pretty good source for most things. And then I started experimenting with other types of plants that I thought would just grow well in half shade or in pots. And there's a wide variety of things, and I've tended to focus on things that I could propagate asexually. so they could get them growing, split them up into other pots and so on and so forth. It's a slow process. Some bromeliads do really well in this situation. Some orchids have done very well in this situation, particularly where they get good sun. There's a few orchids in flower at the moment on this one up here. The other thing that does really well here is pitcher plants, as you can see. But the trick with pitcher plants is that they need to be in a nutrient deficient environment. So you can't put them in the wall garden below other plants because you can't have nutrients from the soil leaching into those pots. So they're always at the top and they thrive. You can see some of these are just doing incredibly well. Yeah. When the irrigation system has failed, things die really fast, and there's been a couple of hiccups on the way. So every step of the way you're learning things, fail-safe systems, that sort of stuff. That's probably the biggest risk to it, is the irrigation system failing, because being a warm, hot climate, things dry out really, really quickly.
And what about in the wet season?
The wet season's fine because it's getting rain on really regularly. It doesn't get too hot in here because of the shade. This is 50% shade. And so it just, everything goes gangbusters. The ferns go nuts, and we're actually cutting stuff back on a regular basis to keep it under control.
So you wouldn't recommend someone do this if they didn't have irrigation set up as well?
Yeah, you need to have an irrigation system, there's no question about it. But you don't need much water. As I said, this system comes on for 2 1-minute time slots a day, and it doesn't use much water. And if you're
so it's
clever
very
about
water-wise.
Yeah, it's very water-wise. If you're clever about it and actually had it in a reticulation system, such as associated with a pond or some other water gathering device, then it would be even more water efficient. The trick is having it on a south-facing wall or an east-facing wall, or having enough shade so that you're not getting massive amounts of evaporative water loss. Yeah.
And what's your favourite thing about the garden?
Essentially having a wall that's the colour of nature, so feeling like you're actually in some kind of rock face, you know, which is covered in lush vegetation. I just don't know how else to describe it.
It's an oasis.
It's very pleasant to look at, and I love the pitcher plants. I think they're really cool, but I just love the interdigitation of all the plants. I love the way it's all kind of meshing together. And some things do well, some things don't. Some things flourish and they fade. Some things outcompete other things. So it kind of changes. It's really dynamic. So if you'd been here a year ago, you wouldn't have seen these big pitcher plants. You wouldn't have seen these oxalis, which are flowering at the moment. They've done incredibly well. So it's different all the time. You know, 6 months' time it'll be different again.
And so if I was starting little with a little bit of sheeting to hang things on, how long would it take to get a little one going?
So I did this in sections. I started out with one panel, just this one here. It's about maybe 1 metre wide and this high. It was one panel of fence, and I just did some trial and set up to see what would work. Some aspects of what I did worked, some of them were complete failure. I let that settle for 3 or 4 months to see what would happen, see what would grow, and then I did my next panel. And I did it somewhere else, in this case a different facet, to see how that would work. And I just brought it up over time. So I didn't do it all in one hit, I did it over about 2 years. I've only recently just finished this one panel about 3 or 4 months ago. It's still becoming established. It's a lot of work, a lot of labour in, you know, cutting up milk containers and doing the angle grinding with the mesh and so on and so forth, and putting irrigation in. And so, you know, doing it in small doses in your spare time and just building it up over time was a nice therapy. But this is quite a big space. I mean, you could build a wall garden any size. You know, you could build a wall garden just a subsection of one of these panels in a really tiny space. You don't need, there's no set minimum of requirement on the space.